The research cuts were supposed to slow China down. That was the theory. Restrict advanced chips, tighten university partnerships, pressure semiconductor equipment exports, make scientific collaboration politically radioactive, and eventually China's innovation system would stall somewhere in the middle income trap. Instead, last month, 2 American research centers quietly shut their doors while China opened 19 new facilities tied to quantum systems, advanced materials, AI hardware, biotech, and industrial robotics. Nobody really noticed. That's the strange part, because this isn't just about laboratories. It's about whether the world's most advanced economy still remembers how long-term power actually works. One of the American facilities was tied to battery chemistry research, connected to next-generation grid storage. Another focused on applied photonics, the kind of technology that matters for everything from fiber optics to missile guidance systems. Both ran into funding problems. Not scientific dead ends, funding problems. Meanwhile, in Hefei, Wuhan, Shenzhen, and Hangzhou, Chinese provincial governments are pouring billions into research parks most Western audiences couldn't locate on a map. And before somebody says, China just builds empty projects for headlines, yes, sometimes it does. There are absolutely ghost industrial parks in China. There are local officials chasing targets and wasting money. That's real. But it's also true that SMIC moved from being dismissed as technologically dependent to producing 7-nanometer class chips under sanctions severe enough that many analysts thought progress would freeze entirely. Washington released restrictions. China released more engineers. This is apparently the new diplomatic language. The deeper issue here isn't even technology, it's institutional patience. America still has incredible universities. The best concentration of scientific talent on Earth probably remains in the United States. MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, national labs, venture ecosystems. None of that disappears overnight, but the funding structure around research has changed in ways people outside academia rarely see. Federal basic research spending as a share of GDP has been drifting downward for decades. Universities increasingly depend on corporate partnerships that want short-term commercial outcomes. Public companies answer to quarterly earnings calls, not 10-year materials science timelines. China operates differently, not always better, differently. When Beijing identifies a sector as strategically necessary, it can absorb years of low profitability without political panic. The Ministry of Science and Technology, the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, what people call the Big Fund, and provincial governments coordinate around industrial persistence. Sometimes the investments fail spectacularly, but failure inside a large system still produces infrastructure, trained engineers, supplier networks, manufacturing experience. That's the part many Western conversations miss. Research centers are not isolated buildings. They're talent magnets, training pipelines, supplier ecosystems. They create people who later create other things. A 26-year-old engineer working in a robotics lab in Suzhou today might build the dominant industrial automation company of the 2030s. The lab itself may never become famous. That almost doesn't matter. And there's another layer underneath this. The technologies China is targeting aren't random. Look closely at the 19 new facilities announced over the last month. Photonic computing, synthetic biology, advanced manufacturing systems, solid-state battery materials, satellite communication architectures. These are technologies that sit between civilian and military power, between economic growth and geopolitical leverage. The same AI accelerator that trains language models can improve autonomous drone coordination. The same battery chemistry that extends EV range also matters for naval systems and energy storage resilience. This is why the story matters beyond research headlines. Because when countries stop investing in foundational science, they usually don't notice the consequences immediately. The effects arrive later, slowly, then all at once. First, you lose manufacturing depth, then supplier ecosystems, then talent. Eventually, you wake up dependent on another country for technologies your own universities helped invent. Britain went through versions of this. So did parts of post-Soviet Russia. Industrial decline rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels administrative. Budget meetings, hiring freezes, delayed grants. Then one day the future is being designed somewhere else. And the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all this is whether the United States still believes science is a public strategic asset, or just another line item that needs to justify itself every quarter. Because China already answered that question years ago. There's a habit in Western tech discussions that keeps distorting this story. People look at China's breakthroughs and ask, did they copy this? when the more important question is becoming, how long have they been building the capability underneath it? Capability is slower, less cinematic, harder to tweet about. Take Hefei. 15 years ago, most international investors barely cared about the city. Today, it has become one of China's most important research and industrial corridors, especially in quantum technology and advanced manufacturing. The University of Science and Technology of China moved major quantum programs there. Local government funds backed labs before they produced commercially useful results. Companies clustered around them. Suppliers followed. Then venture capital arrived after the ecosystem already existed. That order matters. In much of the American system today, capital often waits for proof first. China increasingly funds the environment that creates the proof later. A good example is quantum communication. In 2016, China launched the SMIC satellite through the Chinese Academy of Sciences, demonstrating satellite-based quantum key distribution over enormous distances. At the time, a lot of commentary treated it like a prestige project. Interesting science, symbolic politics, not immediately practical. But here's what happened afterward. Fiber optic quantum networks expanded between Chinese cities, dedicated research institutes multiplied, and telecom infrastructure firms gained experience integrating the systems into real-world architecture. They weren't just publishing papers, they were building operational familiarity. That distinction becomes important later, because technological leadership usually goes to the country that scales systems, not the country that invents the first prototype. Britain pioneered many early computing concepts. The United States industrialized computing. Japan dominated advanced manufacturing techniques for decades after others invented parts of the underlying process. History keeps repeating the same lesson, and people keep acting surprised by it. And honestly, some of America's current research problems are self-inflicted. Over the past 20 years, universities became increasingly financialized. Administrators multiplied. Young researchers spent enormous amounts of time chasing grants instead of doing research. Tenure-track positions shrank relative to temporary academic labor. Meanwhile, China aggressively recruited global talent through programs like the 1,000 Talents Plan before Washington began tightening scrutiny around intellectual property transfer and academic partnerships. Some of those concerns were legitimate, by the way. Industrial espionage exists. State-directed technology acquisition exists. Pretending otherwise would be naive. But America often responds to strategic competition by becoming more suspicious, while China responds by training more engineers. Those are not symmetrical reactions. In 2000, China produced roughly the same number of science and engineering PhDs annually as the United States in several technical fields. Today, the gap is enormous in areas like electrical engineering, materials science, and manufacturing-related disciplines. According to data from Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, China now graduates far more STEM doctorates annually than the US, especially when excluding international students. And before someone says, quantity doesn't equal quality, that's true. Completely true. But eventually, quantity creates statistical inevitability. If enough people are trained inside advanced systems with modern equipment and stable funding, some percentage of them become exceptional. That's how industrial ecosystems mature. The funny thing is that America actually understands this principle perfectly when it comes to sports. Nobody expects to dominate Olympic swimming by shutting local pools and hoping talent magically appears anyway. Yet with science, there's this recurring belief that innovation naturally emerges out of vibes, entrepreneurship, and TED Talk energy. It usually emerges from boring institutional continuity, from labs staying open long enough for expertise to compound. And this is where the story starts connecting to ordinary people in ways that sound abstract until they suddenly aren't. Research leadership determines who captures the profitable layers of future industries. Whoever dominates battery chemistry influences EV supply chains. Whoever controls advanced industrial robotics shapes manufacturing costs globally. Whoever leads in photonics affects telecommunications, defense systems, sensors, computing efficiency. These aren't isolated sectors anymore. they overlap. A country that leads in advanced materials improves aerospace systems. Better aerospace systems improve satellite deployment capacity. Better satellite systems improve military communications and logistics. Better logistics lower industrial costs. Industrial scale funds more research. The cycle feeds itself. China understands the loop. The United States still has enormous advantages. Venture capital depth, top-tier universities, global talent attraction, semiconductor design leadership through firms like NVIDIA and AMD, unmatched alliance networks. This is not some "America is collapsing" argument. That's lazy analysis. But there is a difference between having advantages and maintaining them. And I keep coming back to those 2 research centers that closed last month because closures create invisible second-order effects. Scientists relocate. Graduate students change fields. Equipment sits unused. Collaborations disappear quietly. No headline tracks the opportunities that never happen afterward. Meanwhile, somewhere in Shenzhen tonight, a 24-year-old researcher is probably running simulations on materials the West won't care about until they suddenly matter a decade from now. And by then, the difficult part won't be understanding the technology. It'll be catching up to the ecosystem behind it. But there's a complication here that makes this story harder than the simple China rising, America declining narrative people love online. Research spending alone does not automatically create innovation dominance. The Soviet Union produced brilliant scientists. So did Japan in the 1980s. Europe still generates world-class research papers today. Yet none of them built the same combination of scientific leadership, software ecosystems, venture scaling, and global technological influence that the United States managed after World War II. Because innovation isn't one machine, it's several systems colliding at once. And China still has real weaknesses. Its semiconductor industry remains heavily dependent on foreign lithography equipment at the cutting edge. ASML in the ASML still controls EUV lithography systems that China cannot easily replicate. Chinese universities publish huge volumes of papers, but some researchers quietly admit there are incentives to prioritize quantity over originality. Debt inside provincial governments is becoming serious enough that some local research subsidies may eventually slow down. There's also a political constraint people avoid discussing openly. Scientific breakthroughs require a degree of intellectual freedom. Not infinite freedom, that's romanticized, but enough room for dissent, experimentation, failure, and saying, the senior official is wrong. America historically excelled at this chaotic environment. Researchers could move between universities, startups, defense contracts, and private labs with relatively little central control. That flexibility matters. So if you stopped the analysis here, you could make a strong case that America still wins in the long run. Many serious analysts believe exactly that. The U.S. remains dominant in advanced chip design, aerospace, foundational AI models, biotech venture capital, and elite research institutions. The dollar still anchors the global financial system. American firms still attract global talent at a scale nobody else fully matches. All true. But here's the reversal that keeps bothering me. The real competition may no longer be about who invents first. It may be about who industrializes second. That sounds subtle. It isn't. The United States still generates extraordinary ideas. The issue is increasingly what happens after the breakthrough. Manufacturing moves abroad. Supply chains fragment internationally. Scaling becomes expensive. Environmental approvals drag for years. Skilled industrial labor shortages appear. Meanwhile, China absorbs the applied phase. The factories, suppliers, component ecosystems, process engineering, workforce training. And over time, the applied phase starts generating its own innovation. This happened with solar panels. Early photovoltaic breakthroughs came heavily from American, European, and Japanese research. China eventually dominated manufacturing scale. Then manufacturing scale improved process efficiency. Process efficiency lowered costs. Lower costs expanded deployment. Expanded deployment funded more iteration. Today, China controls enormous portions of the solar supply chain from polysilicon to module assembly. The same pattern is appearing in batteries. CATL wasn't supposed to become this dominant this quickly, yet China's battery ecosystem now benefits from vertically integrated supply chains, massive domestic demand, refining capacity, and relentless iteration through production scale. Tesla helped accelerate EV adoption globally. China built the surrounding industrial terrain. That difference matters more than people think, because once a country controls industrial ecosystems at scale, research starts becoming easier. Engineers move between factories and labs. Problems are identified faster. Prototype cycles shrink. Supplier feedback becomes immediate. Manufacturing itself becomes a research advantage. America separated innovation from production over decades because globalization made it economically rational in the short term. The long-term bill is arriving now, and there's a national security layer underneath all of this that Washington increasingly understands, but still struggles to operationalize. Pentagon reports over the last several years repeatedly warned about dependency risks in rare earth processing, pharmaceuticals, microelectronics, battery supply chains, and critical minerals. During the COVID period, Americans suddenly discovered how much industrial capacity had quietly migrated overseas. People remember the mask shortages. Fewer remember the pharmaceutical ingredient dependencies. A civilization notices supply chains only when they fail. China noticed earlier. That's partly why Beijing keeps funding research in areas Western investors often consider too slow, too infrastructure-heavy, or too politically uncertain. Synthetic biology, grid systems, industrial robotics, new materials, satellite networking. These sectors may not maximize quarterly returns immediately, but they shape national leverage later. And honestly, the United States is trying to respond. The CHIPS and Science Act was a serious piece of industrial policy. Semiconductor fabs are being expanded in Arizona, Texas, Ohio. Federal research conversations are changing tone. Even the language in Washington has shifted from pure globalization toward resilience and industrial capacity. But policy announcements and ecosystems are not the same thing. An ecosystem is what happens after the press conference ends. And the uncomfortable possibility, the one policymakers rarely say aloud, is that America may have recognized the problem after China already built too much momentum to stop cleanly. Remember the number from the opening: 19 new Chinese research centers in 1 month. That number matters less for what those labs are doing today than for what they represent psychologically. A country preparing for a 30-year competition behaves differently from a country optimizing for the next election cycle or earnings report. And this is where I think a lot of commentary misses the emotional core of the story. China's leadership genuinely appears to believe the next phase of global power will be decided by engineering depth, industrial resilience, energy systems, AI infrastructure, and scientific self-sufficiency. Not speeches, not financial branding, not culture wars. Physical capability. Whether people like Beijing or not is almost secondary to that reality. Meanwhile, parts of the American system still behave as if technological dominance is a natural law instead of a historical condition that requires constant maintenance. Empires get used to being ahead, then they slowly confuse existing strength with permanent strength. History is not kind to that mistake. But I also don't think this ends in some dramatic China replaces America movie script scenario. The world is too interconnected for that now. The more realistic outcome is something stranger, a bifurcated technological order where China dominates certain industrial systems while the United States retains leadership in others. AI models, aerospace software, biotech platforms, advanced finance, semiconductor design on one side, manufacturing ecosystems, battery supply chains, industrial robotics scale, and applied infrastructure on the other. Less Cold War, more parallel operating systems, and ordinary people will feel this long before they understand it academically. The price of electronics. Which country controls EV supply chains? Which currencies settle industrial trade? Which nation's standards become global defaults? Where talented researchers decide to move, even military balance shifts quietly underneath technological ecosystems most people never see. A drone swarm is not just a military object. It's batteries, sensors, chips, communication systems, manufacturing precision, software, rare earth processing, and logistics networks compressed into one machine. That's what this competition is really about. Personally, I think the United States still has enough institutional strength to reverse parts of this trend. American universities remain extraordinary. Its ability to attract ambitious people from everywhere is still unmatched. And when Washington finally decides something matters strategically, it can move with shocking force. But there's a condition attached to that optimism. America has to remember that research is not a luxury product produced after prosperity. Research is one of the reasons prosperity existed in the first place. China seems to understand that already. The prediction? Over the next decade, the biggest geopolitical fights won't mainly be about territory. They'll be about talent pipelines, compute power, energy grids, materials science, and who owns the infrastructure underneath advanced civilization itself. Quiet sectors, huge consequences. And somewhere tonight, another research building is probably opening in China, while another budget meeting happens somewhere in the West, explaining why long-term science needs to be streamlined. That word alone has probably delayed more innovation than sanctions ever did. If you want more videos that look past headlines and into the machinery underneath global power, you know where to find me.